was like mid last year where I gave a presentation, kind of like a part one to this, talking about deciduous techniques. I'll kind of like recap and go over that again. So for those who basically wasn't there for that presentation, I'll give some context to that. But I also have like a lot of this information and articles on my website. I have that over here. It's just justbonsai.com. So if you guys need to reference the information later, you can easily look it up. I'll just kind of briefly go over my background. I think I've met a lot of you guys already, so I'll just kind of brush over this quickly. But at least my professional background in bonsai, I apprenticed at Fujikawa Kokaen in Osaka, Japan. I was kind of there 2 years and came back right when the pandemic started. In that kind of interim, just doing bonsai semi-professionally, like a side hustle. And then kind of in the last 2 years or so, I've been doing this as my kind of primary full-time career. And so, right, I do a lot of professional services and travel in California and other parts of the US for bonsai clients. But later, at any point, you guys have questions in terms of my experience and apprenticeship background, I'm happy to talk about that and share that. And so I'll kind of just get straight into it. But my previous talk was just talking about this concept of like developing deciduous trees, right? How do you build branches, build layers in branches, ramification and whatnot. Kind of as a little preface, envision that for our tree, right, or any given tree, one goal in bonsai is to kind of evoke the size and the scale, right, of say possibly a large tree in nature, right? Your smaller kind of like tree, you want it to have that visual impact and presence of say like a 100, 200 foot tree. And the ability for our tree to kind of convey that size, right, that presence, directly relates to how we grow the branches, right? This is a very intentional process. And fundamentally, it comes down, well, in the case of deciduous trees, is our cutting technique, right? We can't really add branches per se on a tree. I mean, of course, there's grafting techniques, right, to place new foliage, branches, and whatnot. But fundamentally, we always remove things from a tree, and we rely on the tree's response, right, to that work. What did it grow when we cut off a branch, and how did it grow a branch? And from kind of having a reliable and predictable response, right, we're able to develop our tree. And so kind of this recap on, I like to just first discuss the principles of like why we are cutting our trees. There's just a few concepts to consider, so I'll kind of rehash all of these really quick. So first is like, why do we cut branches, right? What's the point of it? What does it yield? And also, how do we cut it, right? Like clean branch technique, right? It's very intentional. It's beyond just cutting something to a shape, right? If you purely are just cutting your tree to some aesthetic shape, it's no different than, say, like hedging, right? Or just kind of cutting a bush. And really goes much deeper than that to produce a nice quality tree. And then I'll just touch a little bit on like pitfalls of just poor cutting technique and things to avoid. And so these kind of next 10 slides will just sort of be this recap, sort of summary, and the kind of meat of the presentation will come after this. So kind of fundamentally, cutting branches gives us the ability to bifurcate a branch, right? So you have one given branch line, you cut it, it can double, right? Go from 2, 4, 8, and so forth. And so the maximum number of branching a tree may have, right, is directly related to how many cuts we do and when we did the cuts. Kind of discussing and touching back a bit earlier, if one goal in bonsai is to show like this size scale, right, of this relative tree in nature, right? So you have this large, like kind of very evoking, like large presence tree. It's probably very realistic that, a 50, 100, 200 foot tree has thousands of branching on it. And this is achievable, right, in bonsai. And so if that is one motivation and goal, right, to have a nice quality tree, then we just need to know that the cutting, right, this bifurcation concept directly influences, right, how many branches we can have. If you have a very small tree, but say some given whatever 10-inch tree only has 10 or 20 or 30 branches on it, that visual impact and scale is probably not very believable as a large tree, right, which is realistically nature will have thousands of branches. And so this is obtainable through technique, right? You can make your branches proportionally smaller and increase the number and the yield, right? So this kind of lower tree on the bottom is kind of this top-down view of a trident maple, and this given tree probably does have thousands of branches on it. That tree is no more than, say, like maybe 15, 18 inches tall or so. It's not very big. So this is kind of just like a graphical representation of this concept, right? If branches keep doubling for every cutback, it's like this exponential gain of branches, right? So this kind of lower axis, right, is the number of times we cut the tree, and then this kind of bar up here is the number of branches. So theoretically, and this is probably not very realistic, but if you're branching perfectly double 10 times in a row, right, you would have over 1,000 branching, right, by the time you reach the tip. There's some physical limitation where at some point you'll reach a point where for both like a physiological reason, like just the health of the tree can't support so many branching, and just the physical space. So I'm not necessarily implying and saying that you need these super crazy ramified trees for it to be a good bonsai, but it is just something to consider, right? So kind of rehashing that, right, we can get a high density of branching, right, to evoke that kind of size scale. But another concept to consider when we cut a branch is that we gain natural movement and directionality. And a good way to think about this, say for a given branch line, right, we know there's always lateral buds on the side. When you cut this branch line, right, that lateral bud's going to elongate. It just guarantees the branch will change direction, right? If you cut a branch, it doesn't grow the exact same pathway as it was growing before. And so in theory, for every cut interval, as you cut a branch, you get small little kind of adjustments of movement and directionality. So kind of good examples of this, think of like oak trees, right? Very abundant in California. We can see them on all the interstates. Say like the valley oaks, the live oaks, they have this kind of very undulating, contorted, moving branches. This concept is similar, where on a full-size tree, maybe it's just by nature or the environment, right? A branch end dies, or it's forced to grow in a new direction, right? Just from some kind of environmental factor. By effect, we are kind of replicating that on our smaller trees, where we're trying to produce trees with good movement. And so this idea, right, is also kind of seen in Penjing. So say like bonsai outside of the scope of Japan, if we look in China and other parts of Asia, we have trees, right, with branch lines with really strong directional movement in lines, right? You can really see these individual lines, right? They carry a lot of movement. And movement like this is not produced by wiring, right? It's through cutback technique. Even if you wire branch to whatever the nth degree and you contort the branch as much as possible, there's physical limitations, right? First of all, of course, if you bend a lignified branch too much, it'll crack. So the reality, your interval of movement is just related to the pitch of how tightly you wrap the wire. And then also at the greatest bend, it's going to be in some ratio of an arc, right? You can't really take a branch and do these really tight, kind of compact bends. And so I would say the quality and the degree of movement, right, is much lower. Of course, you can still use wire as a tool to develop your trees, but in case of deciduous trees, it's used in conjunction with cutting technique, right, where it is actually physically not possible to create branch lines with just great movement solely by wiring. So just kind of like an idea to see. And then for those who went to the Bonsai-thon, right, they have the Chinese gardens out there. Their curator there, right, this is his tree on the left. And so he's very good actually at this kind of very clean, intentional branch technique to create good movement. And so if you kind of want a real like in-person example to give concept for cutting for movement, the Chinese Gardens at the Huntington, right, has some great trees there that showcases that. And so kind of right, we talked about we get more density, right? Helps evoke this size scale. You want your small tree to have that impact of the bigger tree, and then cutting for movement as well, right? Additionally, as you cut branches and you build them outward, you can get progressively more taper, and you want finer and finer branch tips, right? You don't want like your tree to have these really knuckled and thick branch tips on the end. It loses some elegance, right? Some softness. And so it's kind of important you maintain that softness in the design. And so doing these cutting techniques properly, right, helps yield quality like that. And by effect, your tree will just gain better maturity. It's beyond just some plant subject, right? But your individual tree just gets a presence of its own, right? And it starts to really represent, right, this size scale, right, evoking this kind of larger tree. This is very important. So kind of going a little bit into, I guess, the principles. One thing to consider is like, how do we cut the branches? And I'll kind of talk about different merits and different approaches to this. This will just be a kind of a brief summary of this, but I have this in much greater detail on my previous presentation. So I think actually the club has my last PowerPoint. You can find that, or just go to my website. And if you don't get kind of what I talk about here, you can get much greater detail and context in this part. But just a very simple concept is that for any given design, right, your first cut, the technique to build out this tree must always begin smaller, right, than your intended silhouette size. And so we can say, like, arbitrarily, say just for a given trunk, there's probably some ideal, like, size of the tree, right, that looks best for our given trunk. If we have a tree and you just keep growing the branches longer and longer and longer, at some point, it's like the canopy is just gigantic, right, and the trunk is nothing. And your tree kind of just loses its presence and individuality. Conversely, if the branches are too short, right, maybe you don't have much interest in your design. So we can kind of give a premise that in general, there is an ideal size of the tree, right, where it looks best. And so if we have this defined space that we're building all the branches in, it's just important to note that for that target size, your work must precede it. So maybe my tree looks great when it's 15 inches tall and we have this kind of 10-inch canopy, right? Even though that's the aesthetic ideal, when you first cut the tree, it might start much smaller. And that's not saying that like, oh, I cut the tree really small because I want it to look like that. It's you're undertaking the process of a tree which inevitably will always grow bigger, right, as a living being, that you kind of work towards that target size, right? So making sure that for your given vision, right, your initial branch work, it has to start smaller. Don't cut branches too long in an early stage of development, right? The branches will always get bigger. Another thing to consider is how thick a branch is, right? To have kind of visually impactful and interesting branches. And this general concept is actually for any tree, right? Not just deciduous. Kind of just as a very general rule of thumb, ideally a main branch coming off the trunk, should be kind of like 20 to 25% of the trunk thickness if you intend to show off that branch, right? A lot of times you see old trees where you have this massive trunk and then these tiny little pencil-thick or smaller branches. And so there's some kind of mismatch in visual weight. You have this super powerful tree, these really tiny wimpy branches. And the thing is, once you start cutting branches a lot, the rate it thickens just gets slower and slower and slower, right? Say kind of like if we look at trees in the mountains, right? Junipers, pines, and whatnot, they have extremely slow growth rates, right? Kind of averages people give, like for some collected junipers, it's like an inch of growth per 100 years, right? by effect, like what we're doing when we're cutting a branch, we're introducing stress, right? You're forcing the tree to grow again. Naturally, it's pretty expected that the growth rate will be slower. And so if your branch is not at a good ballpark thickness of what you want and you cut it too early, what may have taken you, say, 1 year to grow that branch, right, is now going to take you 5 years or 10 years, or maybe it doesn't even get there in your lifespan. And so there are like not really good true shortcuts, right? A good perspective to have nice trees is just to undertake things as a process. How do you just incrementally improve the tree such that for as long as you work on it, it always gets better, right? Especially for deciduous, and many trees are long-lived, you can have a tree that can mature over decades, right? Every single year the tree gets better. And that's really kind of something that's valuable in kind of the practice of bonsai and a really good way to kind of enjoy our trees and make high quality trees. So it's a small tip, right? Don't cut things too fast necessarily. Make sure your branch is thick enough, right? That's very important. And so kind of, and again, I have this in more detail, kind of if you guys want to look up my previous presentation. But one thing that I've kind of been advising not to do is don't cut young branches too long. So a common way people make trees, and the intention is to try to make the tree very quickly, is that, say for our given trunk line, we've defined there's some ideal silhouette size, right? And so people are like, well, I know my tree looks best at this size, so let me grow the branches as quickly as possible. So they grow long branches that fills the profile, right, of their aesthetic ideal. Anything that grows beyond that, right, they cut it short. And so this is basically hedging, right? The problem with developing trees this way, even though you can make a full silhouette quickly, ultimately what you have in the long run is just a bush, right? Where the branch lines lack movement, there's no taper. The density is actually lower than if you cut early. Because say for a given tree, and I'm talking about this kind of arbitrary example, I'll have this 15-inch tall tree, 10-inch wide canopy, so maybe there's this 5-inch radius I can grow branches in. If I can cut my branch, say, every ½ inch, right? It means your branching can double every cut. Theoretically, when you reach the outer silhouette, there's going to be 1,000 branches. But if you grow a branch too quickly and you just cut it on the outside, so the first cut happened at this 10-inch radius, right, as opposed to the 5-inch part, you just don't have any more space to grow branches, right? The tree is always going to grow bigger. I'm sure you might get some interior buds to elongate, but the difference in branching is a significant order of magnitude, right? It'd be 1,000 branches versus like 50. So the quality of the tree ultimately ends up much worse, and also long-term your branch tips knuckle. A good way to think about this, a lot of times people will say, if there's 3 branches in one spot, right, they're like, oh, cut out the 3rd one, only keep 2. And the idea is you have too many branches growing in one spot, right, that branch end will thicken, right, it'll knuckle. Similarly, say if you have, maybe it's not 3 branches in one spot, but they're in close proximity. You have a region that on average most of your branches are always growing from. If you always generate growth from the same region over and over and over, it's natural that over time it's going to grow thicker, right? So basically in an intention of if you expedite this process, right, you try to build the tree quickly, ultimately you set yourself up for failure, that tree will stop progressing, actually the branch quality gets worse and worse. So there's like concessions to how you do things, right? If you expedite a process, it is merely a trade-off, right? There's no true shortcut in bonsai to have nice trees, and this is universal, that anything kind of worthwhile, it really does take time, right? There's no like kind of miracle answer in terms of technique or process. So just as a recommendation, don't try to grow young branches too quickly. Don't fill the silhouette shape too fast, right? And it's not saying that like, oh, I have to take this ridiculous journey to have 30 years to make a nice tree. If you just employ the process of just always improving your tree, maybe the tree is not at its aesthetic ideal in the beginning, but it still looks fairly decent, the branching gets mature, and just every year thereafter gets better, right? And so this idea of just not rushing is important, and this is from a technique standpoint, right? It's not like we're just taking the long route just because we like to spend more time, right? So that's kind of like the recap. It was very like, kind of just broad and general, and so for those who were there in that first presentation, that was kind of a bit of a refresher. Otherwise, I do have all that information. You can kind of read in more depth, right? You can provide better context. So I'll kind of just go into the purpose of this presentation. The way I basically teach for like my workshops, clients, and students is an approach we can take doing bonsai is first, I kind of start with the principles. It's like, that was kind of like the recap, like why are we doing this? Like what does it yield? The analogy I always give, it's like say, like a chef, right? That has great technique, right? And cooking skills or knife skills or whatever. But they have like a horrible palate. In the end, like bad tasting food is bad tasting food, right? It doesn't matter like how well it was prepared. And so even before the application of technique, you need to know like why am I doing this and what the direction is. Otherwise, technique is wasted, right? You achieve nothing. So first is kind of understanding the principle. Now the second part is, and we start getting a little bit more into the technique, and in the case for trees, I'm going to talk about like energy and balance, right? Where a big assumption that I had in kind of this previous recap is that when you cut a branch, it's going to grow, right? This is not necessarily true. Say if it was like in a perfect world, it just by default it would grow when you cut it. It would be so easy to develop trees. But the reality, there's so many things we consider, like how strong is the branch, right? How is it growing? What is the relation to branches around it? And I'll kind of go over these things in more depth. So just note that cutting a branch, right, doesn't equal a growth response. So this is where like the intentionality comes in, where at least if we have some purpose and idea, right, we know what we're making. Now it's kind of just like, well, what can we do so we can take steps to achieve that? So kind of as another, just a note that I put into here, like we really need to consider all techniques and principles and context. And so I'll try to provide a lot of context in these later slides, but the takeaways shouldn't take this too literally, right? We're like, oh, I saw this bullet point, I'm going to do exactly this to my tree. If you use stuff out of context, right, you know, the response might not be good, branches can die, your tree can die. Everything is done with intentionality. So when we cut a tree, right, we're considering how strong a branch is, right? How much energy is stored in the branch, and then the balance, like relative to branches around it. And so you have weak regions, strong regions, right? Trees always want to take the path of least resistance. So naturally, a stronger part of the tree wants to grow stronger, and a weaker part can grow weaker, right? So that's pretty important. Before I talk about this, I'll just go over some fundamentals. We'll just talk about how do we evaluate strength and energy in the tree. And this will be kind of broad, but actually this concept is not just for deciduous. You can apply this for other species as well. And so kind of fundamentally what we're assessing in the case of broadleaf and deciduous trees is the budding ability, right? Say for the bifurcation model, I had that kind of exponential graph, right, where every time I cut, the branching doubled, so it just kept getting more and more and more. That's like a assumption that every time I cut, the branching will double, right? And so the ability for a tree to push multiple buds and strong buds, right, so it has a good growth response, right, is directly related, I call it to this accrued strength, right, the energy in the branch. And so I'll have this kind of like very rough analogy, but the way I like to describe it is just this idea of momentum, right? How much momentum does a branch have? And so say we have like some cyclist, whatever, right? And they're just like, this is like a clear, straight road, right? And they're just speeding down, you know, whatever arbitrary speed. And then there's like a rock or whatever in its pathway. And there's just like, there's no time for this cyclist to move, right? It's just, they're gonna hit the rock, right? Let's just leave the other options out of this example, right? They're gonna crash, it's inevitable. And so, you know, maybe if this cyclist wasn't moving very fast, you know, it would probably be okay. Just be like a little tumble, right? But maybe if they're traveling like very quickly, right? And especially those who like are cyclists, right? And then, you know, like very well, like how hard is it, right? If you hit the pavement. And it's just kind of, this is self-explanatory, right? I don't need to explain this. It's just like, if you have a lot of momentum and something just stops you, right? There's that carryover of momentum, right? You don't just suddenly stop moving, right? There's that kind of carryover effect. And so it's kind of like a dumb analogy, but the way to consider this is that like our branch is also accruing momentum, right? It's accruing speed. And this relates to how long has a branch been growing, how healthy it is, how strong it is, right? And this kind of rock in the road, it's like when we cut the branch, right? We give the tree no choice, right? We cut something off, the tree has to do something. And its response is going to relate to how fast was it going. Was it just kind of like a walking pace, just slowly kind of meandering down this road? Or were they just like booking it, right? Kind of like a Tour de France, whatever, just as fast as they can. It's kind of obvious, right? If it's really fast, you know, and you stop it, there's this carryover effect of momentum. And so this rock in the road, we're imposing on the tree, right? We're telling the tree that we've stopped you, whatever you're doing, and it has no choice, right? It has to respond. And so this is kind of just a visual analogy that response is kind of just related to how fast it's growing, right? This is very predictable. It's not just like, I cut a branch and it's who knows what's going to happen, and we guess it. You can know exactly what's going to happen, right? And to have that ability to kind of read like this kind of situation of the plant, how it responds, it just makes it easier, right? If you have a goal and how you're going to develop your tree. And so kind of this kind of graphical example, the way I like to frame this, there's kind of these 4 key growing periods, right, for all of our trees. First, kind of early spring, as I defined for Southern California, say January through April. Late spring is kind of April through June. We have a summer period, right, June through August, and the fall, right, kind of subsequent months after. In the early part of the year, right, say early spring, our trees have low momentum in that they just expended a bunch of energy, right, to push out the buds for that year. It hasn't been growing that long yet, so there's not much return, say, on the energy you just expended, right? It has to flush out the leaves, photosynthesize, and start storing energy for later. So I kind of consider this a very low momentum state, right? The tree, you know, it just got started, right? It's just barely moving. We head into late spring, right? There's more foliage. The tree has had time to elongate, push out runners, more leaves, right? And it's getting a little bit stronger. Now, typically by the end of spring, towards midsummer, and this will vary depending on the climates we're located in, but generally trees can be very strong. That not only they have the vigor of pushing new growth, but there's a lot of existing growth, right, that already flushed out in the springtime, which means there's just all this energy, right, that's feeding into the tree. So it has a lot of momentum at this time. And then when we go back to fall, things start slowing down a bit, right? The tree still has a lot of foliage and the ability to produce and store a lot of energy, but in the fall time, the goal is not so much for the tree to grow, but it's prepping for next year, right? Setting the buds for that following spring. And so, so what we can consider is like, what happens when we cut the tree at different times of the year, right? you have to excuse these drawings. You're just kind of very low effort, like 30-second drawings, but I kind of just made this on a shorter notice. So let's just say if we cut the tree like really early in the year, right? Like our trees are just kind of budding out right now. There's these little leaves coming out, and say we cut it like sometime this month or early next month, and your tree has only had like whatever, a month to grow, right? And a lot of times people do this because they have their nice tree or whatever, and they're like, oh, these branches are so long, let me just cut it back to shape, right? So it looks nice again. If you do this, right, its kind of resulting growing response will be very weak. Just kind of like the cyclist analogy, there's just no momentum generated yet, right? So for maybe this walking pace moving cyclist, you know, maybe they can maneuver around the stone, right? Or they just have a very light bump and it's not a big deal. And so generally, if you're developing your tree, right, this is not a good thing, because I talked about in kind of the previous principles, when we cut a branch, I'm assuming something's going to grow. And maybe we don't just grow one branch, but we grow 2 branches right at the cut, right? So we can keep increasing the density of the tree. And so say if our goal in cutting the tree is to develop it, right? We want to add branches on the tree. Or of the ones remaining, they grow strong, like say in the Penjing example, getting branches with good movement, right? And necessary thickness. You don't want like a big trunk with wimpy, skinny branches. You know, these things take a lot of energy. And so kind of like in this just example here, say we have this given bud, right? And we have one bifurcation here. Maybe our goal for this branch was to go from 2 to 4 branching, right? That was the intention. I want a little bit more density on the tree. But if you cut the tree at a very early stage, there will be 2 scenarios that can happen. First, the tree just stops growing because you've just cut off its kind of power source, right? And there's been no time for the tree to conserve energy. So there's nothing stored in the tank, right? So there's no carryover, no momentum to push the next piece to grow. So maybe it doesn't even grow at all. You just stop it, right? And if you're developing the tree, right, it's probably not a good thing. The second option is maybe it does grow, but say like even though there could be, say, 2 buds on the tip, even though there's 2 buds, the tree only has enough energy to push one of them. So maybe our intention was to develop the tree, like, oh, I want more branching on this tree, so it better represents this larger tree in nature, right? You get that size scale. But instead, you went from 2 branches, and it's still 2 after, right? So it's kind of like a wasted cutback. There was no net change in the tree. There's nothing achieved out of it. And so if you're developing a tree, right, on average, you do not want to cut your tree in the early spring, right? And this is probably the most common mistake I see just amongst hobbyists. Well, for one, there's this like a time urgency, right, of every, and this maybe is just very like cultural thing where we're just trying to get stuff done like faster and faster and faster, and so we're just like, well, we want to cut it now. I want the shape to look good now, but if your goal is to build branches, add branches on the tree, you know, it really doesn't pan out. And I'll kind of talk about the opposite of this later. But say if your tree wasn't in development, right? You have this like beautiful, super mature tree with our whatever 1,000 branches. Maybe at that point, our goal is not to produce any more branches. You want to prevent the branches from thickening, right? Or maintaining that tip fineness. In which case, an early cut like this makes sense. But for the far majority of people, trees still need some more development, right? You don't want to cut in the early part of the year because the tree just doesn't have energy yet to push multiple buds. And so say we have another case study, right? We waited another month and we're going into late spring, which I kind of talk about from the tail end of April, usually around May, early June. And so now the tree's had, you know, a few months to grow. So not only has it been pushing that spring growth, there's like a return on the tree, right? It's been photosynthesizing, there's energy stored in the branches. And so when we cut the tree at this time, there's just more momentum, right? There's more speed. So that carryover effect is more prominent. And so when we cut back those tips, right, that we wanted to bifurcate, right? In this case, it will. So maybe we go from our 2 branches. Now it becomes 4. Sometimes if the tree is very strong, you might get like a back bud or something pushing out, right? Like a lower branch like this. And so if you're developing the tree, like you need to cut later, right? It's really important you let the tree grow first. And so you have to separate the idea of having a good bonsai tree doesn't mean it looks good at all stages of development. Like inevitably to develop something, you have to let it grow. If you just constantly cut a tree, especially with bad timing, just nothing will develop. And so, sure, maybe in the months of March through April, it looks like a little messy, right? You let all this stuff grow long, but if your long-term goal is to progress and improve the tree, it becomes necessary to do that, right? Where, say, if you opt to cut the tree to favor the short-term aesthetic, so you cut it early, you keep this nice shape, you really just took the future of the tree, right, to develop better. And most of us practicing bonsai, this can be a lifelong endeavor. Certainly the trees, in theory, can live longer than any of us. And so for as long as you practice it, generally it's better if you can get the tree constantly improving for the time you're working on it. In the long term, it'll be more enjoyable and you'll have a better quality tree. Unless your intention is just to be kind of a one and done, cut it, enjoy it for a year, and then quit, right? In which case, yeah, it makes sense. But I think most of us are probably not in that scenario. So the summer situation is basically the same thing, right? The tree is a little stronger. What this means is for a lot of species, we can apply kind of this cutback concept multiple times a year, right? Especially it's in a vigorous state. But the summer is essentially the same thing. One thing to consider, and this depends what kind of microclimate you're in, say you're more inland, it's a little bit hotter, that if we do force a growth response in the summertime, and we have potentially very hot, like arid weather, we have like Santa Ana winds, it's really bad if you cut the tree and it grows, and say the new growth dies for whatever reason. It got burnt in the sun, or low humidity winds. It just means that your tree prepared energy to produce another flush, and it just went in the trash. And that's like, your tree will enter a very stressed state. And so the summertime is no different than cutting earlier, but you just need to be more mindful, depending where you live, how the weather is, just to ensure you're protecting the tree. Another kind of observation, and probably you don't have to worry about this so much in San Diego, but in very kind of extreme temperature situations, say where the soil, right, is exceeding kind of 70, 80 degrees. So maybe at that temperature it could be the 90s or hundreds outside. Maybe you just have direct sun exposure on the pot for long durations. Actually, when the soil temperature gets too high, right, the tree starts slowing down. They transpire less and they stop moving as much water. So even though the tree is capable of growing, the growth can start to get stunted at this time period. So you just have more considerations regarding weather. But otherwise, it's the same as late spring.
Julian?
Yeah.
In that scenario, with the summer heat, Santa Ana's,
Yeah.
if you did not cut them, when would you cut?
Well,
that second.
Like, and so actually I'll touch on this, like how far we can push the cut. I mean, generally, if you can, you want to take advantage of the meat of the growing season. So when temperatures are warm, the tree's growing, you can get a lot of development done on your tree. And so for me, I will still work on my tree in like high heat intensity, but I have like shade cloth, right? Or I keep it out of the wind and just ensuring I protect it. Because you can just say opt not to work it, right? Knowing that there's some risk because of the weather, but you've also just lost the window of development. Sometimes you just can't fill it in and get it later, because there is some time limitations of how late in the year you can do the work. So that kind of like ties into this last case, right? Which is the fall time. And so generally, like my cutoff for major branch work, say for just deciduous broadly, for Northern Hemisphere, right, temperate climate, is about the first week of August, right? And this is for like a tree in a growing state, right? Fall cut, like after the leaves come off, that's a different thing, which I'll talk about later. But say like in a growing state, right? We're trying to cut to make the tree grow. The latest I do is kind of around early August. And the reason for that is if we, say, cut a tree so late in the year, right? Maybe September, October. It's still pretty warm, September, October in Southern California. So chances are, if you cut the tree hard, it's going to start growing in September and October. And then so on the surface level, you're like, well, I just got another round of development. Isn't that a good thing? But you need to save time for the buds for next year, right? Now, even in our mild climates, right, trees will enter dormancy. And so at least by December, typically the trees want to go to sleep. But if you cut the tree too late into the year, basically what happens is there's not enough time from when the new flush came out towards the end of the year for the growth to harden off and accrue energy for next spring. And so if you cut late in the year, sure you get another round of development, but it's at the expense of next spring because energy which should be in buds for next year gets burnt now. And so generally major branch work, while the tree has leaves, right, you don't really want to cut too late, right? Tropicals, you can push it later, right? But for temperate varieties, which have a well-defined dormant period, don't do those hard cutbacks too late, right? So kind of like discussing into that, right? Like all of our foliage, right? It's feeding back into the tree, right? In this kind of fall period. It's providing energy for the buds, right? Sending energy into the trunks and the roots. There's this return of energy, right? That's being stored as sugars, carbohydrates that will be expended the following year. And that transfer, right? It's just this natural process in nature. But if you, say, cut leaves or branches at this time this transfer is happening, you're really just weakening the tree a lot for next year, right? And so we just need to be mindful that at least during the active growing period when the tree has leaves, right, it's usually not so good to do major cuts, say like September, October, that's kind of pushing it. Right? So the way to think about this is, and this is kind of like a little bit reverse of the previous graph, is how much energy is stored in the tree, right? So first I was just talking about momentum, how much bigger ability for the tree to grow does the tree have. And in this other scenario, we can think about how much energy is stored in the tree. And this relates, right? The early part of the year, it just expended a lot of energy, right, to grow branches. So naturally, there's just not much stored yet. Come by late spring, right, there's a little bit more energy going back into the tree. The foliage is photosynthesizing, so it's able to store stuff into the buds. And by summer, the tree's really growing, really going, because not only is it pushing foliage, but it has a lot of existing foliage, right, that's photosynthesizing and producing energy. So the tree's really going at this point. And at the fall, theoretically, the tree should have a lot of energy, right? It's really kind of saving up for next year at this point. But here, we just need to be careful, where just because the tree is capable of growing, you don't want to necessarily, like, expend that energy too late, right? But just kind of a general idea, right, as the tree stores energy throughout the year. And so that's kind of like a basic concept, like how strong the tree is relative to the seasons. It's kind of an easy way to look at it. Another thing to consider is bud strength. And I kind of will actually use a triad block for an example for the second part of the presentation. We'll talk about branch scenarios, assess bud strength, and I'll kind of critique my own tree. So this is actually a pretty easy thing to identify, but it's just a lot of times people don't make the effort to look into this. But a very straightforward way to see how strong a branch is or how it's going to grow is just the bud strength, which is just very two simple metrics, like how big is the bud and what's the color of the bud, right? Something that's very healthy and active, right, likely to grow, usually the color is more saturated, the bud starts swelling a bit. something that's not as healthy is going to be smaller, right? Maybe it's not growing, so the color is very dull, right? The color looks very desaturated. And so this is kind of a very easy way actually to physically know, not just guess, right? You can look at the branch and just immediately say, like, this is a strong branch, this is a weak branch, right? So kind of preceding this, though, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between active and dormant buds. And so I'll have some kind of photo examples next. So say like an active bud, something that is going to grow, right, or set to grow, generally is bigger, right, should be obvious in the size difference. And the color, right, I was talking about is more saturated, while the duller buds, right, or the dormant buds, right, just lack that color and size. And the only thing I wanted to emphasize for this point is that an active bud, when you cut to an active bud, it always grows, right? It's set, it's to grow, right? The tree's preparing to grow from it. But a dormant bud, even though that physical site exists, it doesn't necessarily grow when you cut to it, right? You have to think about this whole kind of energy analogy. How much momentum has this tree have? How much stored energy does it have? Can it afford to put energy into this bud side? And so this is kind of the point where I was talking about cutting a branch doesn't equal a growth response, right? This is where you need to think about, like, and this is the intentionality where does it have that momentum and energy to force that dormant bud to grow? And so kind of like in this kind of picture example, right, we have like this right photo where it's a spring bud, right, kind of nice saturated color. We see a little bit of this center elongation, right, it's getting to grow, whereas in this dormant situation, it's kind of duller in color, right, a little bit smaller. So usually it's pretty easy to visually identify. Of course, on every species, the buds will vary, but on the same given plant, you should be able to tell which ones are stronger, which ones are weaker. Usually the difference is obvious. So the more tricky part though, because in this photo, it's like the winter versus spring appearance, but in the growing season, you can have buds that are active and dormant at the same time, right? So say, envision this tree, we have some that are like this nice color, and on the same branch, maybe some that's smaller, right? Or has that dull appearance. And so that's what we have to be mindful of. Just because it's in a growing season doesn't mean every bud is ready to go, right? They're there, but conditionally, right? They can push. And so this kind of I was talking about, it kind of relates to the bud size, right? Bigger ones are stronger, smaller ones are weaker. And this is how we assess how to cut the tree, right? How vigorous it is. And so kind of like a very basic principle, right? Like say in this, I have these kind of these 5 cut scenarios where, say this first line, right? This is just very dumbed down visualization. This first line say, there's no bud, right? We're chopping this branch with nothing on it, right? Just a bare branch, right? The second scenario, maybe you can't tell, but I put a tiny green dot there. It's like a weak bud, right? And this next scenario maybe is a little bit stronger one, right? It's starting to grow again, this medium bud. And then maybe in this subsequent scenario, we have an even stronger bud. And this lastly, maybe it's something like this big kind of bud on the tip, right? We have that in this last scenario. If you want to force a branch to grow, say in like scenario 1, there's like nothing, right? The way you can equate this is like chopping a trunk, right? Maybe there's nothing on the tree. And you're just like, I need to build this over, or I need to grow a new trunk line. And you cut something super hard, and there's nothing, right? There's nothing on the tree. If that tree, like the succeeding growth, is not very strong, right? Probably that tree is going to die, right? Where, like, in order to force growth from nothing, right? You really need to ensure that that momentum is really high. It has a lot of stored energy, right? There's a lot of power in the tree. So when you hit that rock in the road, right? There's no choice but just to keep flying, right? It's just going to go. It's going to carry forward. Let's say in the second case, right? You have a little bit of a weaker bud. Maybe that bud physically exists, right? But it's this kind of dormant, dull color, right? It's desaturated. Probably a good idea to still grow that branch strong before you cut back to it. If you have these weak, tiny buds, and you cut it, say in the early part of the year, March through April, there's a chance that branch also can die. Even though there's a physical site that it might grow from there, there's just no energy to afford to push growth through that area. So this is kind of self-explanatory, right? As it gets stronger and stronger, the growth response gets more reliable, and the need to grow the branch strong beyond it, right, to generate that momentum is less and less. And so say like in dormant season cuts, like cutting after the leaves come off, right, the fall through winter, if you see stuff like well-defined buds like this in the dormant season, you can just cut back to it. And it's going to grow in the spring, right? It's pretty much guaranteed. But in this dormant season, if you cut to like weak buds, right, in this situation, or no buds, it's very risky, right? Where you basically create this chance where maybe the branch doesn't grow, or at worst that branch dies. So kind of like as a proof of concept, and I should have brought this tree, would have been a good example. I was just a little lazy, I only wanted to carry one tree here. But this is a pomegranate, and this is kind of just an experiment on my own tree. But I cut a very strong tree to like no bud, right? And generally most like deciduous varieties, there's defined growth intervals, right? Even if you can't see it later, because let's say the bark gets all like gnarled and grows over it, but there is defined nodes, right? Like a bud, segment, bud, segment, bud, segment. Generally, the tree, even if the bud disappears, it's always going to grow from that node, right? It never disappears. It's like there will be a dormant part in the tree that's capable of pushing growth in the future if conditions are right. And the middle section between the nodes, typically it will never grow, right? And so kind of interestingly, this is an extreme case, that if you grow your tree strong enough, right? Say the momentum is just like physiologically the strongest the tree can ever get, right? It's like the cyclist, just like as fast as it can go, right? In Tour de France. Like chances are, if there is so much energy and momentum in the tree, and you just stop that energy will come out some way. So kind of interestingly, and I've only observed this for these pomegranates, but I think this would be possible on other trees, that the tree can actually just create new buds from nothing, right? So this image here, this is callus tissue on the cut site, and so that's not an inner node, right? That's just where the tree was cut. And it actually just created new buds from scratch, right, from the callus. So basically it's just this kind of basically undifferentiated cells on the growing tips, and if the tree is really strong, it will look for an outlet for it to push growth, right? The tree's first option is not just to die. But this is like in the extreme situation where if you grow your tree strong enough, right, you can force buds and kind of like in a situation like this. But generally, right, I would not rely on this. But my point is more so being that if you can match your cutbacks relative to a strength of the tree and how well it's been growing, the bud response will be 100%. You can predict it every single time. Which means if you have some kind of grand vision of like, I want my branch to be this dense, maybe I want 500 branches here, or this kind of movement in the branch, your vision starts getting easier and easier to achieve because it becomes less random, where I'm just chopping branches here and there, whatever the tree gives me, right, I'll just work with it. You can actually know, right, what the tree's going to give you. And so it's really worthwhile to pay attention to these little things, right? How healthy is that branch to begin with, which relates to kind of looking at the bud, and then how strong does it need to grow, right, to get growth response. So kind of like another note for this is that, and this has kind of been emphasizing this throughout this whole presentation, is that when you work a tree, right, you not only have aesthetic considerations, right? Cutting a tree only to look good is probably, that's just like hedging, right? Say like in an English garden or something, you have some boxwood bush and you're getting somebody to trim it in the shape of a dog, right? That would be like doing that, right, to bonsai, which is really, right, that's not what we're trying to do. And so there's more to that, right? You have to think about like the techniques. How does the tree grow, right? So kind of like that part one, I just talked about principles, like what could happen if we cut a branch, how does it respond? And then beyond that, right, where we need to know, like, how does it happen, right? And this is where the technique comes in. And so maybe you improved your palate, right? You have a good sense and taste and understanding for what makes a good tree. Then at that point, you start thinking about technique, right? And because bonsai are living trees, right, work is always done in consideration to how it grows, right? A living thing always changes, like no matter what. And so this is like fundamentally like a core principle that's necessary if you want to have nice trees, right? To have your greatest success in this practice, really think about that idea. So kind of going into another topic, and we've talked about ways to assess energy in the tree. Another concept is balance, right? And this is actually pretty easy to explain. The gist of it is that on a given tree, a stronger area always wants to grow stronger, right? And a weaker area probably is just going to grow weaker because the tree doesn't concern itself with your aesthetic considerations. It is just looking for the shortest line path to acquire sun, right? What is the most efficient way for it to photosynthesize? Because a tree is only concerned with survival, right? So it's natural that it would just seek this path of least resistance. So all this means is that if we don't balance a tree, right, maybe our small branches could die off, the strong branches get too thick, and it gets harder and harder in the long run to maintain a tree, right? And so we think about how do we make the strong areas weaker and the weak areas stronger. And so, yeah, sorry, I made all these low effort drawings last night, so just don't criticize that. I was just short on time. So let's just say, this is like a terrible example, but let's just say for whatever reason, we didn't like this lower branch, right? It's like, whatever, straight, lacks taper, there's coarseness to it, it doesn't have proportion relative to our tree. And we just decided that, like, just this one branch, like, we need to cut it off, right? The reality is that even if our goal is, say, to cut this branch number 2 and grow something else from it, just because you cut it, right, doesn't mean it will actually grow. Because, say, branch number 1, first, it's higher in position. So, say, in a given pathway of sun, the first branch always gets more sunlight, which by default just means it's going to grow first, right? It's going to grow faster. Secondly, I talked about bud strength, right? If I chop this branch super hard, I'm likely taking the branch back to no buds, right? Or weak buds, while this branch is untouched. So it has like those nice juicy buds on the end. And so you create this great divide, right? These extremes in energy where the upper branch not only has the sunlight advantage, but the buds are just stronger, right? In the lower branch, it gets less sunlight, and it has to make new buds from scratch. And so when you create imbalances like that, the tree is not just going to correct it by itself. It's just going to say, like, well, I have this great branch here, why should I grow on the one we just cut, right? And you can lose the branch, which, say, could be disastrous if you have an old tree and maybe this nice main branch, which somebody took 20 years to grow. And it's going to really suck, right? You lose this 20-year-old branch. And so, realistically, if we wanted, say, this second branch to grow, you just have to cut both of them, right? You have to, even though we like branch number 1, you just need to balance it, right? Are they the same strength? Do they get equal sunlight? And then if so, both of them will grow together, right? And you're able to keep the branch. And so this is like pretty important, where if you only cut the tree with aesthetic considerations, like this one looks nice, this one doesn't look nice, I'm just gonna chop here and whatever, it really doesn't matter what you think, because the tree will just override all of your thought processes, right? And it'll just be like, well, this is the easiest way for me to get sun. And so to have, and this principle, this is actually not just deciduous again, to really have good success in your technique, you are trying to match the path of least resistance with your aesthetic goals. So how can I grow the tree in a way it's naturally going to grow that also looks good, right? That if you can achieve that, that's like best case scenario, right? And so for this reason, and this is kind of why I say don't take some of this advice too literally, is that it's very hard to do, say, selective heavy cutbacks on an old tree. So say, for example, like, and I don't know, I haven't seen the trees, but say like Larry Ragel's trees, right? Maybe he has some old deciduous he's grown for many years or many decades. And because maybe the tree is in a semi-neglected state, maybe some branches are okay, some branches are not, like you probably can't take an old tree and just be like, I'm going to cut branch 1, 3, and 7, and these other ones I'm going to leave. Tree's probably just not going to grow very well, right? So a lot of times you have to just cut everything to the same level, right? Which, depending on the tree, may or may not be worth it. Because when you say cut off old branches, one downside to that is you're removing age from the tree. And so a concept I talk about, and I have actually this on my website also, is this idea of age in cultivation. So we look at not only the physical age of the tree, say in the case of collected trees, right, like Yamadori, like collected junipers, we could start with a tree, right, that's like 1,000 years old, but it has 0 years of development as a bonsai tree. And all this means is that the time spent, say the tree being cultivated, right, as a bonsai, it acquires some character, right, some age, sense of presence from that. And especially old branches, right, do this very well. And so when you take an old tree, you have to think about, is it worth it to chop off these old branches to make ideal branches, per se, right? A kind of funny thing that my boss told me in Japan, he said, when something gets old enough, you just forgive it, right? Where it just has, right, at some point, it just accrued enough character in its ways, right? That there's not enough merit just to force it. And so there's like a trade-off. Say if the branching was truly just like terrible, right? Aesthetically balanced, it's not good, it's probably worth it, right? To do those big cuts and make the tree much better. But say if the tree only marginally improves, it's not worth it resetting the age of the branching. So this is just to be like, don't just, when you learn techniques and principles, the point is not just to like brute force leverage them, like, oh, I can do this grafting technique, or I can do this cutting technique. I'm just going to put my trees all through the same like process, right? Just run it through the cookie cutter, and you just do everything the same by default. Sometimes it might work, sometimes it won't, right? The good thing, say outside of the artistic aspect of bonsai, but just say for just craft in horticulture, fundamentally it's technique, and this you can reason and understand it, right? And so you can be 100% intentional about your work and know what's going to happen. And so really take time to think about what are you producing in your tree? What are these trade-offs, right? So I wanted to just give another context of technique discussion and talk about partial defoliation versus full defoliation. Kind of just to see, like, as like just a raise of hands, how many of you guys know of like partial and full defoliation techniques? Okay, about like half. So these are like fairly common techniques in bonsai where, say if you just Google it, right? Partial defoliation, full defoliation bonsai, you will find some video or article, right, of a hobbyist or professional talking about, you know, what they're doing. And I just wanted to use this technique as an example of poor application of technique, right? Common poor application. And so say I'll just kind of give a gist, a rundown of partial defoliation. Kind of as it implies, we are removing not all the leaves, but some of the leaves on the tree. And so say you have a very dense tree, right? This very lush outer canopy. If you let it grow uninhibited, probably the outside of the tree, which has the fastest exposure to sunlight, is just going to grow the most dense and the most strong. it could grow so strong that no sunlight reaches the interior branches, and over time they die off. And so there's this common technique where people say, you have to partially defoliate your tree, where you cut off all the leaves on the outside, you keep the leaves on the interior, and then this is to like balance the tree, right? You weaken the outside, you let the weaker parts get stronger because they get sunlight now, right? It kind of makes sense, right? That's true. So here's just kind of like an example of this. This actually was not a great photo to use because this is a dwarf variety maple. So, but anyways, this technique is reversed. Normally, say for most trees, say in this picture here, I would have cut both the middle ones out and cut one off the outside, right? Anyways, you don't need to know that for the purposes of this presentation. It's just this idea, right, of removing outer leaves. So say in this context of partial defoliation, where our goal is to allow more light, right, in the inside, to balance the tree. Typically, this is done in a very early part of the year, right? So March and April. If we go back to our kind of energy diagram, we know that in this early part of the spring, there is not that much energy stored in the tree yet. So basically what it means is that if you partially defoliate your tree, sure, maybe those inner branches can get stronger, but the tree is actually not going to grow in response. There is no momentum yet. So a lot of times if you cut your tree early like this, growth is kind of on hiatus, right? It just stops moving until summertime. And so if your tree is in refinement, maybe that's a great thing, right? If you have a nice old mature maple, elm, whatever, probably you don't want to lose those inside branches because could have taken somebody decades, right, to grow it. You really value those. In that context, it makes sense, right? But say if you have a tree you're growing, right, from the tips out. I've talked about you cut branches small, keep getting bigger and bigger, and you're trying to add branching on the tree. And if you do a technique like this, you've just lost your first 3 months of your growing season, right? It's time the tree could have been developed. And so a lot of times, people will take techniques too literally, where say you Google partial defoliation, and they're like, it will make the weak area stronger and the strong area is weaker. And so people by default just do it to their tree, regardless of the stage of development, right? But in this kind of scenario, it's very detrimental, because maybe our goal was to go from the 2 to 4 branches, and then we just go from 2 to 2, and nothing happens. So say if our goal, and so this was kind of going over our previous slide. So if, say, we talk about full defoliation, where we remove everything off the tree, right? We cut off every single leaf. If you do that to a tree, the tree has 2 choices, right? Either it's going to grow or the tree's going to die. You cut everything off. And chances are, if you've grown your tree strong, it will always grow, right? It's not just going to like croak that easily. And so actually, I recommend, and this is requiring that you grow your tree very healthy and strong, that if your goal is to develop branches, it's better to fully defoliate a tree, right? Cut every single leaf off. And this usually can be done, say like May through July, especially like maples respond very well to this. And you can get more growth development in a given year, assuming your tree is healthy. Of course, you don't want to cut everything off, right? It's not growing very well. But that's just a fine difference in technique, right? Where you're cutting some of the leaves off versus all of the leaves, right? But the context of application, right, is very different. So I just kind of wanted to use that as an example, like in terms of like being more mindful in our technique. I know this is probably like super broad and a lot to talk about for people who haven't like seen this before, but the idea is just still relating fundamentally to balance, right? How strong is the tree? Is it going to grow after we remove something, or is it going to stall out, right? And these are very common techniques. You can find a lot of information on this online, so I can provide more context to that. And so here's like a trident maple, right? That was fully defoliated, minus branches I'm trying to thicken. So I pretty much cut off every single leaf, except for these lower branches I've let elongate. And this is just to force the tree into an immediate growth cycle. So in a given year, I can get more development, right? More progress in the tree. But say if I were to take this same tree, and say it's like springtime, and I did a partial defoliation, so maybe there's still a lot of leaves here, and I just cut the ones on the very outside. Actually, its response is slower, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive. Like, why does the tree I took off less foliage from, right, meaning it has more kind of like solar cells to produce, grow slower than the one I cut more aggressively on? And really part of it's when we say partially defoliate, the tree's like, oh, I still have a little bit of stuff on that's feeding. It's not as stressed, right? There's less urgency. And so these things do make a difference, right? So kind of like just some summary and closing thoughts. And I'll switch over and talk about this tree after. But in general, timing of cuts is important, right? So really think about, am I developing this tree? Am I making branches? Most of us are, right? It's really, there's no shortcuts. You just have to grow your branching. If you're developing your tree, right, the work is going to defer versus, say, a tree maybe you acquired that's already done, right, quote unquote done, like an old mature tree. And on average, if you're developing your tree, don't cut too early in the year, right? A lot of times people cut like March, early April, the tree just barely been growing. And if you do that, and say if your goal is to build branches, probably the tree is not going to grow, right? So this is about like having predictable growth responses, not just cutting randomly and just seeing what does the tree give us, right? If we're cutting randomly, it's no different than just hedging the bush. Another thing, right, to think about is make sure you save energy for next year. So I talked about the fall season. Normally my last major work in the active growing season is usually early August. If you push that window too late, then you start spending energy, right? That should be used for next year. So timing, right, very important. And then kind of what I'm talking about is with the buds, and I'll show with this tree later, is how, pay attention to how your tree grows. And you don't have to do a lot of guesswork, right? The tree will tell you exactly how it's growing, how strong a branch is, how weak a branch is, how likely is that branch going to grow, right? These are visual and physical cues that have direct correlation. And so you can know exactly what's going to grow. And so pay attention, right? Don't just cut things to shape or just for an aesthetic ideal. Pay attention to how the bud looks, the branch looks, right? It'll just give you more control and more kind of predictability in your work. And then balance, right, is important. So you have to consider how much sun does a branch get, its proximity to a weak or strong branch, right? The tree doesn't care about your aesthetic considerations. It always seeks the path of least resistance. So what is the fastest way it can get sunlight? So you're trying to match that path of least resistance to how your tree wants to look, right? So say if you give it no choice but to grow in the shape you want, right? That's like a win-win, right? You get your tree faster. And then kind of lastly, I kept reiterating, like, be like intentional in your use of techniques. So kind of this whole stage development thing, am I developing a tree or am I refining a tree? This application of timing and the purpose, right, is important. Like, I mean, if you really get into like the nitty gritty, I mean, you could break down the practice of bonsai to like a science, right? It can be very, very deliberate. And so, not saying that you just have to obsess over everything, look at every single bud on your tree, measure the size, and you can just have an idea, right? Just a ballpark, and that's enough to help inform and guide you. Segue to the second part. I'll just talk about this tree very briefly. I guess I'll put on the camera. The front is from this side. So this is a cork oak that I've been growing for about 8 years or so. So it's still a tree in development, right? This is a tree that's, I would say not, for me, it's not ready to be exhibited. I'm still building the branching. But pretty much everything from, say, this point up in the trunk, plus all the main branches was grown from scratch. So it just started with like this lower piece, right? Everything else was grown after that. Well, I guess I'll talk a little bit about the development. Say like upper parts of the trunk like this to build it out. Before I can even start developing the branches, right, I had to grow this trunk pretty thick. So do you see like this old wound here? You can see it's almost fully healed. This was a chop, like whatever, 8 years ago, like here. Interestingly, the chop started pretty flat, right? And as the tree grew up and grew thicker, it just kind of moved and it slanted over time. But it's just to say that as you're developing the tree, before you even get to the branches, like segments like your trunk lines, your main branches, you really need to grow them thick enough, right? Before you even cut anything. Yes?
Talk about how to do that.
Oh yeah, and so say like this trunk, and probably when I started working on this tree, it was maybe about 2.5 inches smaller. So the tree did actually thicken up quite a lot in the pot. Initially it wasn't in this pot, right? I was growing it in kind of larger like terracotta trainers, bigger wooden boxes, just a container that holds more soil and kind of insulates it, buffers it from kind of like temperature changes, the watering's more stable. So say in these early stages, getting these thick parts of the branches, I mean, you have to just envision there's none of these branches off here, and there's just this one gigantic branch that's like 4 feet tall, right? So to get stuff thick, you really just need to let branches run, right? If you don't do that in early stage of development, it doesn't matter how long you work on the tree. The branch will never thicken, or probably beyond your lifespan, right? It could take extreme, it's like that 1 inch per 100-year kind of thing. And so just ensuring the core of your tree is grown first, right, is important. It'll save you time. And so to grow those thick branches, I probably spent just 3 years just letting the branch grow. And so it's kind of, in a sense, can be boring, right, where like all I did was just select the branch and just let it run. And so that's the reality in the growing parts of development. You really just have to let your tree grow. But say if I was a little impatient, right, and I was like, oh, I don't want to wait 3 years for this thing to get thicker, and I just chopped it off, then you're going to have these like wimpy branches, or maybe this upper part of the trunk, maybe it tapers too fast. Say I go from here, and then it's immediately like a branch thickness kind of piece. It'll look kind of weird. So there's some investment, and just you have to let things run out, which means it's not going to look aesthetic, right? It's not going to fit a shape, but it's necessary to let it get thicker. Yeah.
Okay, so you select the branch, you let it grow. What about all the other branches around?
Well,
This way and that way.
right,
That's
and
my
so like these lower branches here, you can see like stuff like this. And these ones, I've been trying to get a little thicker, but these were essentially like branches which ran out like very long, right? So these kind of lateral branches, before I even cut them, right, they were probably these like 3 feet long plus branches on the side. And I had to wait years, right, before I can cut it. That's very important. But the key thing is because I let it thicken, that branch structure is there. But say if I was like impatient, right, and I was like, okay, I don't want to wait 3 years, I'm going to cut it now, you're just not going to get that time back later. And so say when your tree enters its 5th year development, its 10th year development, its 20th year of development, it's like you've already missed the chance. And the tree actually just never develops, right? Where, sure, I take the concession of spending time to grow a tree those first few years, but that long-term trajectory, the tree just gets like better and better and better, right? So we can think it's that same as that kind of like logarithmic, that like exponential graph that I had for my branch number. Your tree will also get exponentially better over time. But if you take shortcuts in the beginning, you take away the potential of the tree in the future. So say, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, and this tree is not, there's problems with it too. Because when I started making this tree, say like 8 years ago, before my apprenticeship, like my technique and knowledge was like not as complete. So even there is problems with this tree, right, which I'll talk about. Kind of a first kind of issue in that I should have spent a little more time. Probably still should have thickened these lower branches even more, right? Where I talked about that whole kind of quarter thickness of the trunk thing. I mean, these are coming off the sub-trunk. I mean, this part is kind of thick enough, but it would have fared better, visually look more powerful. We think of old oak trees. If I let this run longer, right? But I was a little impatient. I was like, just get started now and just cut it. Kind of one issue there. Additionally, say when we look at branches like this, where a branch like this, it has some basic movement from wire, but this is a branch which was, say, the length from here to here. This was grown very quickly within 1 year, right? I've talked about in my presentation this idea of building in layers, right? You grow a segment, right? You see a cut here, it's cut. We grow another segment, it's cut. You build another layer, it's cut. Here it's kind of, it grew a little long, right? I didn't do as many cut intervals. But for me to fix this branch, right, say I wanted to maximize the movement and density, where it's not just this broad line, but maybe has some kind of crazy contortions and twists, to cut this here would mean I would have to cut every single branch on the tree to this level, just to grow this, right? Because if I cut this, because there is so much abundant branching and buds above this branch will actually die, right? Or grow very weak. And so that's this whole idea of balance, where this was basically a mistake in an earlier stage of development. I should have done more cutback layers here to maximize the movement and density of this part of the branch. But because I didn't do it, say, 3-4 years ago, it's kind of locked into the structure of the tree. So the best hope for this branch, as I grow out strong runners and cut it back, I just have to fill this in with back buds, right? Not as ideal, right? So even this has some issues. I'll kind of talk about, well, first I'll just talk about this tree more broadly before I start pointing out bud scenarios. But let's just say in terms of balance, right, in developing this tree. Ultimately, the reason I say this tree is not exhibitable, first we have branches like this, right, which is kind of a little coarse, not as mature. And the tree can actually get bigger, right, where my initial work just started from a trunk, right, just very small. But every subsequent cut layer, the tree gets a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. Every layer you grow, right, you get branching with more movement, right, a little bit more density. Your tree starts to feel older and more mature. And so if I continue to progress the tree outwards, the quality of the tree will actually increase. But let's just say for discussion, if I wanted this tree the maximum quality at this size, right? It just means that first cut to develop the tree, I should have done those cuts like right up on the trunk. So here's where I kind of, in the past, right, I didn't know, right, it's kind of a little lazy. Like all these points here where, say, these branches got long, same with this, these are single branches which were wired out. Really what should have happened is I should have cut those really short, close to the trunk, because getting those early cutbacks will enable me to get more density. So say instead of the ramification beginning out here, this bifurcation point starts earlier, right? So you get that natural movement and density. And then for this size of a tree, you can maximize that theoretical branch upper limit. So if I want like my 1,000 branch tree, it becomes more imperative that cutback was done earlier. So a little bit of a flaw in that sense, which is also why I believe this will be a better quality tree to grow bigger versus trying to maintain it at this size.
Would you consider opening that top up more so that the bottom can get more of the sunlight and growth?
Well, okay. Yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit. The way actually I grow my deciduous trees, and this is this whole concept of starting on the inside and growing out, is that every single branch will get equal sunlight because I grow every branch from the tip out. I'm not really relying on back buds. I have a defined plane of the kind of silhouette, right? And every branch is radiating outwards. So actually these lower branches will grow, but say if I wanted stuff like in the interiors here, it's not necessarily just thinning the top, but I have to cut back the top like harder to make it smaller. And so if my intention was I want to keep this tree at this size, that would be the correct choice. But since I'm growing the tree bigger, which means I have capacity to develop branching from the tip more, that's kind of okay in that scenario. Because kind of what you're talking about, I say a common way, I call it kind of like more old school technique, you see many deciduous trees being made, is that before a lot of times people made a tree, like every tree aesthetically looked like a pine, where you have a branch coming out, it's flat, and then the foliage comes up, right? And even old deciduous trees were developed like that. In situations like those where you have defined interior planes of foliage, thinning the top, like in that situation, would make more sense, because in that case, you really need those interior branches. But the way I have this set up, every branch tip I grow from the outside, right? So for me, it's a more natural, kind of softer deciduous look. And it's easier to grow the tree very balanced because every single tip will access sunlight, right? So that's kind of a bit of an aesthetic and technique distinction, say between like some other styles of deciduous work. But on average, I find the trees do look better and they balance better. And the long-term trajectory, you can make a nicer tree that way for kind of deciduous broadleaf. So one other kind of observation and critique on this tree is that notice like the leaves on the top is much smaller than the bottom, right? And the reason for this, right, is that like, and actually we can see in this case very obvious, this main branch here is kind of sparse, right? And we consider this the primary line. I have like 1, 2, 3, some random little branches, 4, 5 in there. So we can say off this one line, there is 5 branches that's diverting the energy of this line, right? Whereas say this branch up here, off a given line, there's probably like 20, 30, 50 branches coming off one branch line. So just by default, the energy is being subdivided over more tips, the leaf naturally gets smaller. So kind of what happened here was initially I did try to see if this branch would grow thicker, right? I was letting it run. So there was just not very many branches. But when I cut it back, there's just, as a lower branch, there's just not enough strength to push interior buds, right, in the back, right? You can see there's bud sites here, there's like full internodes, right, but no growth coming out of it, which just means for the energy of this branch, it has less lines it needs to share with, which just means for every leaf it gets more food and the leaves grow bigger. So one thing I just wanted to emphasize is that getting small leaves on your trees is just naturally achieved just through cutting technique over time. The more branches you have, the more energy the tree has to share, and naturally the foliage will get finer and finer and finer. So I never tell people you should never do technique on an early stage of development to make the leaves small. It just means you have a weaker tree. You will naturally get small leaves just from developing a tree, right? So this is like, this difference here is just due to this kind of difference in development and kind of the flaws with this branch. But over time, this will correct and normalize as I develop this area more. But a lot of times people have younger trees, and they're like, oh, I really like these small leaves though, and they cut it too much or defoliate it to get small leaves. But it kind of defeats the purpose. Like, sure, you have small leaves, but there's no branch development, right? It's all superficial. So that part doesn't matter so much, right? You will just naturally get that over time. So kind of going over to a more specific case-by-case basis and how to develop this tree in the future. Ultimately, right, I want this like broader canopy. Think of like these old kind of sprawling oaks, right? Really elongate these outside branches. And as I'm growing this, right, I'm thinking of which tips will grow strong, which ones will grow weaker. This is good to show because this tree just barely started to wake up, but say we can see these buds on the tip, right? Little buds here, even these ones there. They're kind of like saturated, have some color, some size. We know they are growing, or they're going to grow, right? Buds like this. Let's say, look at this bud, for example, right? On this branch, which was cut before. Here's a tiny, tiny bud here, right? But the color is not as vibrant. It's kind of this blackish brown color. This is more kind of green and red. So this is set to start growing, like now, right? Whereas this is probably not going to grow right away, right? Which just means coming in springtime, I probably will get long shoots here, and maybe something tiny and stunted later here. It just means when I cut the tree later, right, I'll have to cut regions like this harder. Maybe something like this doesn't get cut much at all. On the lower branches, I talked about this branch here, where there's these bud sides, right, old bud sides, but there's physically nothing there, right? You see kind of buds like that compared to this. This is just kind of smooth bark. This is unlikely to grow here. If I want something here, this branch needs to be really strong, which means I let this run out not just a little bit, but maybe like over a foot, right, before I cut it. And that was that kind of strength to cut kind of line diagram I had earlier. And so branches like this, which are weaker, if I were to cut this right now, chances are this branch is going to stop growing. Maybe it'll die back, or it just starts to recede, right? It just gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So I just need to be mindful that even though I have this general shape and silhouette, to offset this difference in strength between this branch and this branch, you must let this one grow more, right? And so that when I do cut it, right, we'll have a predictable growth response. One other tip that I will recommend is that when you develop your tree, I'm going to try to see if I can find an example of this on one of these branches. Well, let's just talk about this branch here. Right? We have a little bifurcation here. As you cut your branches, ideally get your desired, say, internode length, your branch size, within 2 cutback cycles, right? So here I have this kind of long branch here, this little bifurcation, smaller ones coming out of it. You see how these are all spaced, right? Every bifurcation, there's no overlap. Say for whatever reason, like I didn't like this branch, and I cut this, and I regrew something from this same junction, even if it's still 2 branches per site. If I grow, and maybe you can tell a little bit, there was one branch here that was cut off. You can see this is thickening slightly. If I redo this branch too many times, right? Say, that's what happened here. There was something long here at a point that I was like, oh, the internode's too big, I can't use it. Let me cut it off and grow a brand new one. In that process of recycling, like a whole new generation of growth in this area, this got a tiny bit thicker. If you do that too many times in a row, your branch ends will knuckle. And so if you want this kind of graceful, flowing, tapered, kind of mature branch line, and you say you mess up your cuts too many times. So like you cut it, it's like, oh, it grew too long, let me do it again. Cut it, grew too long. You can't just keep redoing it over and over. The physical branch will actually change, and instead of a clean, smooth, tapered line, we're going to go from this line, and you're going to get this big bulge here, right, which just kind of loses that elegance. So as you develop the tree, right, you just kind of need to be mindful that, and this relates to how strong you grow the tree, the timing of when you cut it, that you try to produce usable branches quickly, right? You don't want to constantly hedge your tree over and over and over. Another thing to talk about with this tree is that every time I cut this tree, it gets a tiny bit bigger. Maybe only in a given year, the silhouette expands something by 1/2 inch to 1 inch bigger. That part is important because say if I were to maintain this tree just by hedge shearing it, So something grows long, I cut it, say like this branch here, maybe a new one grows long, I cut it, and you keep cutting it to the shape over and over and over and over, like it's like this, but magnified much, much more. And all your branches will knuckle on the end, and you just lose nice, clean, kind of flowing branch lines. So in order to progress branches cleanly, right, to have nice taper, a good line, the tree actually must grow bigger every round of cut. That's why it's pretty imperative that your tree begins smaller than your target size, right? If like my target size is already where it is right now, I'm kind of just maintaining the tree, right? It's hard to improve it, and there's some risk of the branch knuckling over time. But if you give yourself space to develop the tree, you can keep maturing your branching. And so you need a plan, like, even though, say, like, if I want my tree this big, this work begins smaller, right? That part's really important. And so if you take shortcuts where you grow stuff out too quickly just to fill the space, like long term it causes issues, right? So kind of like some critiques on this tree, right? We have some issues with the lower branches where basically I grew them too long and I didn't cut it early enough. So I have a lot of these long, straight-ish lines, which in reality could have had better movement and taper. Of course, to cut them means I have to cut everything, which in case, because I decided I'm making the tree bigger, it's just not worth it. But if I wanted this tree this exact size, right, that could be worthwhile. There's some like difference in strength, right, where this branch, right, I talked about, is not as strong. Another thing that I can do is just keep this side of the tree south-facing, so sun always hits this branch, right, and you can get it to grow stronger and stronger and stronger. Another thing, as a tip, as you develop your tree, you can minimize dependency on wire, right? So say I have this one branch line. This one is kind of growing a little bit in the silhouette, right? Generally, I try to get every tip to grow like outwards, right? Something like this. Say I have these terminal buds here, some ones on the inside. Later, I will do this to utilize this branch. You also can just directional prune, right? Cut it to a leaf pointing this way, which bears a bud in that direction. And over time, as you get your branch tips, on average, pointing all outwards, you minimize dependency on wire to develop the tree, and you can rely more on cutting technique, right? Of course, you can use them in conjunction, but generally, nice deciduous trees, say like the ones I showed early on in my presentation, right, those pending ones, nice maples, those are all just right, just through the cutting technique.
Where is your tree living? Where are you?
I'm in Arcadia.
Okay, so you're getting pretty strong sunlight, very high.
It's pretty hot in the summertime. Which for this species it's good. It does like the more kind of arid, warm temperatures. Generally, I do recommend cork oak a lot as kind of, it's like a naturalized California species, very hardy in our climate, and it's easy to develop. So these will grow in San Diego, no problem also. Yeah, so just some considerations of like, I look at how strong the buds are. You have like well-defined, kind of saturated buds, some which are smaller, right, not as strong. Interior stuff, which far in the inside, right, might not get a lot of sun, right, those don't have buds. But in that case, it's not necessary for me to grow them, because in this methodology of developing the tree, I grow everything from the tip outwards, right? It's a very balanced way to develop it. Ultimately, this tree should get quite a bit bigger, right? Kind of, this is my arbitrary kind of imagination, something like this. So there's a lot of space, right, to build layers in the branching. Lower branches are a little weak, so I just need to let them grow slightly longer this year, right? Get more strength before I cut them again. And over time, as these lower branches start matching the upper ones in terms of density, the leaf size will also match, right? There'll be less of this kind of gradient. But remember that leaf size is a secondary goal, right? It's just it's just achieved through cutting technique, right? That should not be the primary goal in developing trees. Certainly, you don't want small leaves at the cost of setting back development. That's kind of the gist of what I wanted to discuss. I'll take any questions, or if you want me to go over, point anything out on the tree, go ahead.